The Biology of Belief by Bruce Lipton, Ph.D. Epilogue. Spirit and Science. The most beautiful and profound emotion we can experience is the sensation of the mystical. It is the power of all true science. Albert Einstein. We've come a long way since chapter 1, when I faced my panicked medical students and started my journey to the new biology. But throughout the book, I have not strayed far from the theme I introduced in the first chapter, that smart cells can teach us how to live. Now that we're at the end of the book, I'd like to explain how my study of cells turned me into a spiritual person. I also want to explain why I am optimistic about the fate of our planet, though I concede that optimism is sometimes hard to maintain if you read the daily newspaper. I've specifically separated my discussion of spirit and science from the preceding chapters of the book by entitling this section the Epilogue. An epilogue is generally a short section at the end of the work that details the fate of its character. In this case, moi. When the awareness that prompted this book first came into my head 20 years ago, I saw something in it that was so profound it immediately transformed my life. In the first instant of my big aha, my brain was reveling in the beauty of the newly envisioned mechanics of the cell membrane. A few heartbeats later, I was overtaken by a joy that was so deep and wide, my heart ached and tears flowed from my eyes. The mechanics of the new science revealed the existence of our spiritual essence and our immortality. For me, the conclusions were so unambiguous that I instantly went from non-believer to believer. I know that for some of you, the conclusions I'm going to present in this section are too speculative. Conclusions drawn in the previous chapters of the book are based upon a quarter of a century of studying cloned cells and are grounded in the astonishing new discoveries that are rewriting our understanding of the mysteries of life. The conclusions I offer in this epilogue are also based upon my scientific training. They do not spring from a leap of religious faith. I know conventional scientists may shy away from them because they involve spirit, but I am confident in presenting them for two reasons. One reason is a philosophical and scientific rule called Occam's razor. Occam's razor holds that when several hypotheses are offered to explain a phenomenon, the simplest hypothesis that accounts for most of the observations is the most likely hypothesis and should be considered first. The new science of the magical membrane brain is in conjunction with the principles of quantum physics offer the simplest explanation that accounts for the science of not only allopathic medicine, but also for the philosophy and practice of complementary medicine and spiritual healing as well. Also, after so many years of personally applying the science I have outlined in this book, I can attest to its power to change lives. However, I concede that while science led me to my euphoric moment of insight, the experience resembled instantaneous conversions described by mystics. Remember the biblical story of Saul, who was knocked off his horse with a lightning bolt? For me, there was no lightning bolt that came forth from the Caribbean skies, but I ran wild-eyed into the medical library because the nature of the cell's membrane that was downloaded into my awareness in the wee hours of the morning convinced me that we were immortal, spiritual beings who existed separately from our bodies. I had heard an undeniable inner voice informing me that I was leading a life based not only on the false premise that genes control biology, but also on the false premise that we end when our physical bodies die. I had spent years studying molecular control mechanisms within the physical body. At that astounding moment, came to realize that the protein switches that control life are primarily turned on and off by signals from the environment, the universe. You may be surprised that it was science that led me to that moment of spiritual insight. In scientific circles, the word spirit is as warmly embraced as the word evolution is in the fundamentalist circles. As you know, spiritualists and scientists approach life in vastly different ways. When life is out of whack for spiritualists, they beseech God or some other invisible force for relief. When life is out of whack for scientists, they run to the medicine cabinet for a chemical. It is only with a drug like Rolaids that they are able to spell relief. The fact that science led me to spiritual insight is appropriate because the latest discoveries in physics and cell research are forging new links between the worlds of science and spirit. These realms were split apart in the days of Descartes centuries ago. However, I truly believe that only when spirit and science are reunited will we be afforded the means to create a better world. A time of choice. The latest science leads us to a worldview not unlike that held by the earliest civilizations, in which every material object in nature was thought to possess a spirit. The universe is still thought of as one by the small number of aborigines who survive. Aboriginal cultures do not make the usual distinctions among rocks, air, and humans. All are imbued with spirit, the invisible energy. Doesn't this sound familiar? This is the world of quantum physics, in which matter and energy are completely entangled. And it is the world of Gaia that I spoke of in Chapter 1, a world in which the whole planet is considered to be one living, breathing organism, which needs to be protected from human greed, ignorance, and poor planning. Never have we needed the insights of such a worldview more. When science turned away from spirit, its mission dramatically changed. Instead of trying to understand the natural order so that human beings can live in harmony with that order, modern science embarked on a goal of control and domination of nature. The technology that has resulted from pursuing this philosophy has brought human civilization to the brink of spontaneous combustion by disrupting the web of nature. The evolution of our biosphere has been punctuated by 5 mass extinctions, including the one that killed the dinosaurs. Each wave of extinction nearly wiped out all life on the planet. Some researchers believe, as I mentioned in Chapter 1, that we are deep into the 6th mass extinction. Unlike the others caused by galactic forces such as comets, the current extinction is being caused by a force much closer to home, humans. As you sit on your porch and watch the sunset, note its spectacular color. The beauty in the sky reflects the pollution in the air. As the world we know decays, the earth promises us an even greater light show. Meanwhile, we are leading lives without a moral context. The modern world has shifted from spiritual aspirations to a war for material accumulation. The one with the most toys wins. My favorite image for the scientists and technologists who have led us into the spiritless world comes from the Disney movie Fantasia. Remember Mickey Mouse as the hapless apprentice to a powerful sorcerer? The sorcerer instructs Mickey to do the chores of the lab while he is away. One of the chores is to fill a giant cistern with water from a nearby well. Mickey, who had been observing the sorcerer's magic, tries to bypass the chore by applying a spell to a broom, which turns into a water bucket-carrying lackey. When Mickey falls asleep, the robotic broom fills and then overfills the cistern, flooding the lab. Upon waking, Mickey tries to stop the broom, but his knowledge is so limited, he fails and the situation gets even worse. The water takes over until the sorcerer, who does have the knowledge to quiet the broom, returns and restores balance. Here's how Mickey's predicament is described in the movie. This piece is a legend about a sorcerer who had an apprentice. He was a bright young lad, very anxious to learn the business. As a matter of fact, he was a little too bright because he had started practicing some of the boss's magic tricks before learning how to control them. Today's very bright scientists are Mickey Mousing around with our genes and our environment without understanding how interconnected everything on this planet is. A course of action bound to have tragic results. How did we get to this point? There was a time when it was necessary for scientists to split from spirit, or at least the corruption of spirit by the church. This powerful institution was in the business of suppressing scientific discovery when it was at odds with church dogma. It was Nicholas Copernicus, a savvy politician as well as a gifted astronomer, who launched the spirit/science split when he released to the public his profound manuscript, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, or On the Revolution of the Heavenly Spheres. The 1543 manuscript boldly declared that the sun, not the earth, was the center of the heavenly spheres. This is obvious today, but in Copernicus's time, it was heresy because his new cosmology was at odds with the infallible church, which had declared the earth to be the center of God's firmament. Copernicus believed that the Inquisition would destroy both him and his heretical beliefs. So he prudently waited until he was on his deathbed to publish his work. His concern for his safety was fully justified. 57 years later, Giordano Bruno, a Dominican monk who had the temerity to speak out and defend Copernicus's cosmology, was burned at the stake for his heresy. Copernicus outsmarted the church. It was hard to torture an intellectual when he is in his grave. Unable to kill the messenger, the church eventually had to deal with Copernicus's message. A century later, French mathematician and philosopher René Descartes insisted on using scientific methodology to examine the validity of all previously accepted truths. The invisible forces of the spiritual world clearly didn't lend themselves to such analysis. In the post-Reformation era, scientists were encouraged to pursue their studies of the natural world, and spiritual truths were relegated to the realms of religion and metaphysics. Spirit and other metaphysical concepts were devalued as unscientific because their truths could not be assessed by the analytic methods of science. The important stuff about life and the universe became the dominion of rational scientists. If the spirit-science split needed any more reinforcement, it got it in 1859 when Darwin's theory of evolution made an instant splash. Darwin's theory spread across the globe like today's internet rumors. It was readily accepted because its principles dovetailed with people's experiences in breeding pets, farm animals, and plants. Darwinism attributed the origins of humanity to the happenstance of hereditary variations, which meant that there was no need to invoke divine intervention in our lives or our science. Modern scientists were no less awed by the universe when the cleric/scientists who preceded them, but when Darwin's theory in hand, they no longer saw a need to invoke the hand of God as a grand designer of nature's complex order. Preeminent Darwinist Ernest Mayr wrote, "When we ask how this perfection is brought about, we seem to find only arbitrariness, plainness, randomness, and accident." When Darwinian theory specifies that the purpose of life's struggles is survival, it does not specify a means that should be used in securing that end. Apparently, anything goes in the perceived struggle because the goal is simply survival, by any means. Rather than framing the character of our lives by the laws of morality, the neo-Darwinism of Mayr suggests that we live our lives by the law of the jungle. Neo-Darwinism essentially concludes that those who have more deserve it. In the West, we have accepted the inevitability of a civilization that is characterized by the haves and the haves not. We don't want to deal with the fact that everything in this world has a price. Unfortunately, this includes, along with the alien planet, the homeless, as well as the child laborers who sew our designer jeans. They are the losers in the struggle. We are made in the image of the universe. On that early morning in the Caribbean, I realized that even the winners in our Darwinian world are losers because we are one with the bigger universe/God. The cell engages in behavior when its brain, the membrane, responds to environmental signals. In fact, every functional protein in our body is made as a complementary image of an environmental signal. If a protein did not have a complementary signal to couple with, it would not function. This means, as I conclude in that aha moment, that every protein in our bodies is a physical/electromagnetic complement to something in the environment. Because we are machines made out of protein, by definition, we are made in the image of the environment, that environment being the universe, or to many, God. Back to the winners and the losers. Because humans evolved as complements of their surrounding environment, if we change the environment too much, we will no longer be complementary to it. We won't fit. At the moment, humans are altering the planet so dramatically that we are threatening our own survival as well as the survival of other rapidly disappearing organisms. That threat encompasses Hummer drivers and fast food moguls with lots of money, the winners, along with poverty-stricken laborers, the losers, in this competition for survival. There are two ways out of this dilemma: to die or mutate. I think you should seriously ponder this, as the need to sell Big Macs leads us to decimate the rainforest, as the staggering numbers of gas-guzzling vehicles foul the air, or as petrochemical industries erode the earth and pollute the water. We are designed by nature to fit an environment, but not the environment we are now making. I learned from cells that we are part of a whole and that we forget this at our peril. But I recognize that each one of us has a unique biological identity. Why? What makes each person's cellular community unique? On the surface of our cells is a family of identity receptors, which distinguish one individual from another. A well-studied subset of these receptors, called self-receptors, are human leukocytic antigens, or HLA. They are related to the functions of the immune system. If your self-receptors were to be removed, your cells would no longer reflect your identity. These self-receptorless cells would still be human cells, but without an identity, they would simply be genetic human cells. But put your personal set of self-receptors back on the cells, and they again reflect your identity. When you donate an organ, the closer your set of self-receptors matches the receptors of the person who is receiving the organ, the less aggressive the rejection reaction launched by the recipient's immune system. For example, let's say that a set of 100 different self-receptors on the cell of each cell is used to identify you as an individual. You are in need of an organ graft to survive. When my set of 100 self-receptors is compared to your self-receptors, it turns out that we have only 10 receptors that match. I would not be a great organ donor for you. The very dissimilar nature of our self-receptors reveals that our identities are very different. The vast difference in membrane receptors would mobilize your immune system, shifting it into hyperdrive to eliminate the foreign, i.e. not self, transplant cells. You would have a greater chance of success if you could find a donor whose self-receptors more closely match the ones on your cells. In your search for a better donor, however, you will not find a perfect 100% match. So far, scientists have never found two individuals who are biologically the same. However, it is theoretically possible to create a universal donor tissues when you remove the cell's self-receptors, though scientists have yet to carry out such an experiment. In such an experiment, the cells would lose their identity. The receptorless cells would not be rejected. While scientists have focused on the nature of these immune-related receptors, it is important to note that it is not the protein receptors, but what activities the receptors that give individuals their identity. Each cell's unique set of identify receptors are located on the membrane's outer surface, where they act as antennas, downloading complementary environmental signals. These identity receptors read a signal of self, which does not exist within the cell, but comes to it from the external environment. Consider the human body a television set. You are the image on the screen, but your image did not come from inside the television. Your identity is the environmental broadcast that was received via an antenna. One day you turn on the TV and the picture tube has blown out. The first reaction would be, oh, bleep, the television is dead. But did the image die along with the television set? To answer the question, you get to another television set, plug it in, turn it on, and tune it to the station you're watching before the picture tube blew out. This exercise will demonstrate that the broadcast image is still on the air, even though your first television died. The death of the television as the receiver in no way killed the identity broadcast that comes from the environment. In this analogy, the physical television is the equivalent of the cell. The TV's antenna, which downloads the broadcast, represents our full set of identifying receptors, and the broadcast represents the environmental signal. Because of our preoccupation with the material Newtonian world, we might at first assume that the cell's protein receptors are the self. That would be the equivalent of believing that the TV's antenna is the source of the broadcast. The cell's receptors are not the source of its identity, but the vehicle by which the self is downloaded from the environment. When I fully understood this relationship, I realized that my identity, myself, exists in the environment whether my body is here or not. Just as the TV analogy, if my body dies and in the future a new individual or biological television set is born who has the same exact set of identity receptors, that new individual will be downloading me. I will once again be present in the world. When my physical body dies, the broadcast is still present. My identity is a complex signature contained within the vast information that collectively comprises the environment. Supporting evidence for my belief that the individual's broadcast is still present even after death comes from transplant patients who report that along with their new organs come behavioral and psychological changes. One conservative, health-conscious New Englander, Claire Sylvia, was astonished when she developed a taste for beer, chicken nuggets, and motorcycles after her heart-lung transplant. Sylvia talked to the donor's family and found that she had the heart of an 18-year-old motorcycle enthusiast who loved chicken nuggets and beer. In her book called A Change of Heart, Sylvia outlines her personal transformational experiences as well as similar experiences of other patients in her transplant support group. Paul P. Pearsall presents a number of other such stories in his book, The Heart's Code, Tapping the Wisdom and Power of Our Heart Energy. The accuracy of memories that accompany these transplants is beyond chance or coincidence. One young girl began having nightmares of murder after her heart transplant. Her dreams were so vivid that they led to the capture of the murderer who killed her donor. One theory about how these new behaviors became implanted into the transplant recipient along with the organs is cellular memory, i.e., the notion that somehow memories are embedded in cells. I have immense respect for the intelligence of single cells, but I have to draw a line here. Yes, cells can remember that they are muscle cells or liver cells, but there's a limit to their intelligence. I do not believe cells are physically endowed with perception mechanisms that can distinguish and remember a taste for chicken nuggets. Psychological and behavioral memory does make sense if we realize that the transplanted organs still bear the original identity receptors of the donor and are apparently still downloading that same environmental information. Even though the body of the person who donated the organs is dead, their broadcast is still on. They are, as I realized in my flash of insight while mulling over the mechanics of the cellular membrane, immortal, as I believe we all are. Cells and organ transplants offer a model not only of immortality, but also for reincarnation. Consider the possibility that an embryo in the future displays the same set of identity receptors that I now possess. That embryo would be turned into myself. My identity is back, but playing through a different body. Sexism and racism become ridiculous as well as immoral when you realize that your receptors could wind up on a white person, a black person, an Asian, or a male or female. Because the environment represents all that is, or God, and our self-receptor antennas download only a narrow band of the whole spectrum, we all represent a small part of the whole, a small part of God. Earthlanders. While the TV analogy is useful, it is not a complete one because a television is only a playback device. In the course of our lives, what we do alters the environment. We change the environment simply by being here. So a more complete way of understanding our relationship to spirit is to compare a human to the Martian rovers, Spirit and Opportunity, or the other NASA landers who have sent to the moon and Mars. Humans are not yet able to go physically to Mars, but we really want to know what it would be like to land on Mars. So we send up the equivalent of a human explorer. Although the Mars rovers don't physically resemble a human, they have functions of humans. These vehicles have cameras, which are the eyes that see the planet. They have vibration detectors, which are ears that hear the planet. They have chemical sensors, which taste the planet, etc. So the lander is designed with sensors that can experience Mars somewhat as a human would experience it. But let's look a little more closely at how the Mars rovers work. The rovers have antennas, or receptors, that are tuned to receive information broadcast by a human being in the form of a NASA controller. The Earthbound controller actually sends information that animates the mariner on Mars. But the information is not a one-way street. The NASA controller also learns from the lander because the vehicle transmits information about its Mars experience back to Earth. The NASA controller interprets the information about the lander's experience and then applies that new awareness to better navigate the Martian terrain. You and I are like Earthlanders who receive information from an environmental controller/spirit. As we live our lives, the experiences of our world are sent back to that controller, our spirit. So the character of how you live your life influences the character of yourself. This interaction corresponds to the concept of karma. When we understand it, we must take heed of the life we live on this planet because the consequences of our life last longer than our bodies. What we do during our lifetime can come back to haunt us or a future version of ourselves. In the end, these cellular insights serve to emphasize the wisdom of spiritual teachers throughout the ages. Each of us is a spirit in material form. A powerful image for the spiritual truth is the way light interacts with a prism. When a beam of light goes through a prism, the prism's crystalline structure refracts the exciting light so that it appears as a rainbow spectrum. Each color, though a component of the white light, is seen separately because of its unique frequency. If you reverse this process by projecting a rainbow spectrum through the crystal, the individual frequencies will recombine, forming a beam of white light. Think of each human being's identity as an individual color frequency within the rainbow spectrum. If we arbitrarily eliminate a specific frequency, a color, because we don't like it, and then try to put the remaining frequencies back through the prism, the exiting beam will no longer be white. By definition, white light is composed of all frequencies. Many spiritual people anticipate the return of white light to the planet. They imagine that it will come in the form of a unique individual like Buddha, Jesus, or Muhammad. However, from my newly acquired spirituality, I see that white light will only return to the planet when every human being recognizes every other human being as an individual frequency of white light. As long as we keep eliminating or devaluing other human beings we have decided we don't like, i.e., destroying frequencies of the spectrum, we will not be able to experience the white light. Our job is to protect and nurture each human frequency so that the white light can return. Here's a picture of rainbow light over here going through a prism and becoming white light, or vice versa. Fractal evolution, a theory we can live with. I've explained why I am now a spiritual scientist. Now I'd like to explain why I'm an optimist. The story of evolution is, I believe, a story of repeating patterns. We are at a crisis point, but the planet has been here before. Evolution has been punctuated by upheavals which virtually wiped out existing species, including the best known causalities, the dinosaurs. Those upheavals were directly linked to environmental catastrophes, just as today's crisis is. As the human population increases, we are competing for space with the other organisms with whom we share the planet. But the good news is that similar pressures in the past have brought into being a new way of living and will do so again. We are concluding one evolutionary cycle and preparing to embark upon another. And this cycle comes to an end, people are becoming understandably apprehensive and alarmed by the failures in the structures that support civilization. I believe, however, that the dinosaurs that are currently raping nature will become extinct. The survivors will be those who realize that our thoughtless ways are destructive to the planet and to us. How can I be so sure? My certitude comes from my study of fractal geometry. Here's a definition of geometry, which will explain why it is important for studying the structure of our biosphere. Geometry is a mathematical assessment of the way the different parts of something fit together in relation to each other. Until 1975, the only geometry available for study was Euclidean, which is summarized in the 13th volume ancient Greek text, The Elements of Euclid, written around 300 BC. For spatially oriented students, Euclidean geometry is easy to understand because it deals with structures like cubes and spheres and cones that can be mapped on graph paper. However, Euclidean geometry does not apply to nature. For example, you cannot map a tree, a cloud, or a mountain using the mathematical formulas of this geometry. In nature, most organic and inorganic structures display more irregular and chaotic appearing patterns. These natural images can only be created by using the recently discovered mathematics called fractal geometry. French mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot launched the field of fractal mathematics and geometry in 1975. Like quantum physics, fractal or fractional geometry forces us to consider those irregular patterns, a quirkier world of curvy shapes and objects with more than 3 dimensions. The mathematics of fractals is amazingly simple because you need only one equation, using only simple multiplication and addition. The same equation is then repeated ad infinitum. For example, the Mandelbrot set is based on the simple formula of taking a number, multiplying it by itself, and then adding the original number. The result of that equation is then used as the input of subsequent equation. The result of that equation is then used as the input for the next equation, and so on. The challenge is that even though each equation follows the same formula, these equations must be repeated millions of times to actually visualize the fractal pattern. The manual labor and time needed to complete millions of equations prevented earlier mathematicians from recognizing the value of fractal geometry. With the advent of powerful computers, Mandelbrot was able to define his new math. Inherent in the geometry of fractals is the creation of ever-repeating, self-similar patterns nested within one another. You can get a rough idea of the repeating shapes by picturing the eternally popular toy, hand-painted Russian nesting dolls. Each smaller structure is a miniature, but not necessarily an exact version of the larger form. Fractal geometry emphasizes the relationship between the patterns in a whole structure and the patterns seen in parts of a structure. For example, the pattern of twigs on a branch resembles the patterns of limbs branching off the trunk. The pattern of a major river looks like the patterns of its smaller tributaries. In the human lung, the fractal pattern of branching along the bronchus repeats in the smaller bronchioles. The arterial and venous blood vessels and the peripheral nervous system also display similar repeating patterns. Are the repetitive images observed in nature simply coincidence? I believe the answer is definitely no. To explain why I believe fractal geometry defines the structure of life, let's revisit 2 points. First, the story of evolution is, as I've emphasized many times in this book, the story of ascension to higher awareness. Second, in our study of the membrane, we define the receptor effector protein complex IMPs as the fundamental unit of awareness/intelligence. Consequently, the more receptor effector proteins, or the olives in our bread and butter sandwich model, an organism possesses, the more awareness it can have and the higher it is on the evolutionary ladder. However, there are physical restrictions for increasing the number of receptor effector proteins that can be packed into the cell's membrane. The cell's membrane's thickness measures 7 to 8 nanometers, the diameter of its phospholipid bilayer. The average diameter of the receptor effector awareness proteins is approximately the same as the phospholipids in which they are embedded. Because the membrane's thickness is so tightly defined, you can't cram in a lot of IMPs by stacking them on top of one another. You're stuck with a one protein thick layer. Consequently, the only option for increasing the number of awareness proteins is to increase the surface area of the membrane. Let's go back to our membrane sandwich model. More olives means more awareness. The more olives you can layer in the sandwich, the smarter the sandwich. Which has more intelligence capacity, a slice of cocktail rye or a large slab of sourdough? The answer is simple. The larger the surface area of the bread, the greater the number of olives that can fit into the sandwich. Relating this analogy to biological awareness, the more membrane surface area the cell has, the more protein olives it can manage. Evolution, the expansion of awareness, can be physically defined by the increase of membrane surface area. Mathematical studies have found that fractal geometry is the best way to get the most surface area, or membrane, within a three-dimensional space, or cell. Therefore, evolution becomes a fractal affair. Repeating patterns in nature are a necessity, not a coincidence, of fractal evolution. My point is not to get caught up in the mathematical details of the modeling. There are repetitive fractal patterns in nature and in evolution as well. The strikingly beautiful computer-generated pictures that illustrate fractal patterns should remind us that, despite our modern angst and the seeming chaos of our world, there is order in nature, and there is nothing truly new under the sun. Evolution's repetitive fractal patterns allow us to predict that humans will figure out how to expand their consciousness in order to climb another rung of the evolutionary ladder. The exciting esoteric world of fractal geometry provides a mathematical model that suggests that the arbitrariness, planelessness, randomness, and accident that Mayer wrote about is an outdated concept. In fact, I believe it is an idea that does not serve humanity and should, as rapidly as possible, go the way of the pre-Copernican, Earth-centered universe. Once we realize that there are repeating, ordered patterns in nature and evolution, the lives of cells which inspire this book and the changes in my life become even more instructive. For billions of years, cellular living systems have been carrying out an effective peace plan that enables them to enhance their survival as well as the survival of the other organisms in the biosphere. Imagine a population of trillions of individuals living under one roof in a state of perpetual happiness. Such a community exists. It's called the healthy human body. Clearly, cellular communities work better than human communities. There are no left out homeless cells in our bodies, unless, of course, our cellular communities are in profound disharmony, causing some cells to withdraw from cooperating with the community. Cancers essentially represent homeless, jobless cells that are living off the other cells in the community. If humans were to model the lifestyle displayed by healthy communities of cells, our societies and planet would become more peaceful and vital. Creating such a peaceful community is a challenge because every person perceives the world differently. So essentially, there are 6 billion human versions of reality on this planet, each perceiving its own truth. As the population grows, they are bumping up against each other. Cells faced a similar challenge in early evolution as described in Chapter 1, but the point bears repeating. Shortly after the Earth was formed, single-celled organisms rapidly evolved. Thousands of variations of unicellular bacteria, algae, yeast, and protozoa, each with varying levels of awareness, appeared over the next 3.5 billion years. It is probable that, like us, those single-celled organisms began to multiply seemingly out of control and to overpopulate their environment. They began to bump up against each other and wonder, will there be enough for me? It must have been scary for them too. With the new enforced closeness and the consequent change in their environment, they searched for an effective response to their pressures. Those pressures led to a new and glorious era in evolution, in which single cells joined together in altruistic multicellular communities. The end result was humans, at or near the top of the evolutionary ladder. Similarly, I believe that the stresses of the increasing human population will be responsible for pushing us up another rung on the evolutionary ladder. We will, I believe, come together in a global community. The members of that enlightened community will recognize that we are made in the image of our environment, i.e., that we are divine, and that we have to operate not in a survival of the fittest manner, but in a way that supports everyone and everything on this planet. Survival of the most loving. You may agree with Rumi's words on the power of love are noble ones, but you may not believe that they fit these troubled times. When survival of the fittest may seem more appropriate, isn't Darwin right that violence is at the core of life? Isn't violence the way of the natural world? What about all those documentaries that show animals stalking animals, animals snaring animals, animals killing animals? Don't humans possess an inborn inclination to violence? The logic goes, animals are violent, humans are animals, and therefore humans are violent. No, humans are not stuck with an innate, vicious, competitive nature any more than we are stuck with genes that make us sick or make us violent. Chimps, who are the closest to humans genetically, offer evidence that violence is not necessarily part of our biology. One species of chimps, the bonobos, create peaceful communities with co-dominant males and females in charge. Unlike other chimps, the community of bonobos operates not with a violence-driven ethic, but an ethic that can be described as make love, not war. When the chimps in this society become agitated, they don't engage in bloody fights. They diffuse their divisive energy by having sex. Recent research by Stanford University biologist Robert M. Sapolsky and Lisa J. Scher has found that even wild baboons, among the most aggressive animals on this planet, are not genetically mandated to be violent. In one well-studied baboon troop, the aggressive males died out from contaminated meat they foraged from a tourist garbage pit. In the wake of their deaths, the social structure of the troop was reinvented. Research suggests that females helped steer the remaining less aggressive males into more cooperative behaviors, which led to a uniquely peaceful community. In an editorial in the Public of Science Biology, where the Stanford research was published, chimp researcher Franz B.M. de Waal of Emory University wrote, "Even the fiercest primates do not forever need to stay this way. In addition, no matter how many National Geographic specials you've watched, there is no dog-eat-dog imperative for humans. We are at the top of the predatory prey food chain. Our survival is dependent on eating organisms lower in the hierarchy, but we are not subject to being eaten by organisms higher in the chain. Without natural predators, humans are spared from becoming prey and from all the violence that the term implies. That does not mean that humans are outside the laws of nature, of course, for eventually we too shall be eaten. We are mortal, and following our demise, one would hope after a long and violent-free life, our corporeal remains will be consumed and recycled back to the environment. Like a snake turning on itself, humans at the top of the food chain will eventually be devoured by organisms that are the lowest in the chain, bacteria. But before that snake turns, we may not live a violence-free life. Despite our lofty positions on the food chain, we are our own worst enemy. More than any other animal, we turn on ourselves. Lower-level animals sometimes turn on themselves, but most aggressive encounters among members of the same species are limited to threatening postures, sounds, and scents, not death. And in social populations other than humans, the primary cause of intraspecies violence is either the acquisition of air, water, and food required for survival or the selection of mates for propagation. In contrast, the violence among humans that is directly linked to securing sustenance or in the process of mate selection is quite minimal. Human violence is more often associated with the acquisition of material possessions beyond what is necessary for sustenance or the distribution and purchase of drugs to escape the nightmare world we have created, or child and spousal abuse passed down generation after generation. Perhaps the most widespread and insidious form of human violence is ideological control. Throughout history, religious movements and governments have repeatedly prodded their constituents into aggression and violence to deal with dissenters and non-believers. Most human violence is neither necessary nor is it inherent genetic animal survival skill. We have the ability, and I believe, an evolutionary mandate to stop violence. The best way to stop it is to realize, as I emphasize in the last chapter of this book, that we are spiritual beings who need love as much as we need food. But we won't get to the next evolutionary step by just thinking about it, just as we can't change our children's or our lives simply by reading books. Join communities of like-minded people who are working towards advancing human civilization by realizing that survival of the most loving is the only ethic that will ensure not only a healthy personal life, but also a healthy planet. Remember those unprepared, underappreciated Caribbean students who banded together, like the cells they studied in their histology course, to form a community of successful students? Use them as role models, and you will help ensure a Hollywood ending not just for individuals mired in self-sabotaging beliefs, but also for this planet. Use the intelligence of cells to propel humanity one more rung up the evolutionary ladder, where the most loving do more than just survive. They thrive. Addendum. The science revealed in this book defines how beliefs control behavior and gene activity, and consequently, the unfolding of our lives. The chapter on conscious parenting describes how most of us unavoidably acquired limiting or self-sabotaging beliefs that were downloaded into our subconscious minds when we were children. As I mentioned in that chapter, there are a variety of energy psychology techniques which exploit the latest mind-body research to quickly assess and reprogram those subconscious programs. Before you leave, I'd like to talk a little about one of these energy psychology techniques called Psych-K, because I have personal experience with it and I am confident of its integrity, simplicity, and effectiveness. I met Rob Williams, the originator of Psych-K, at a conference in 1990 when we were both presenters. As usual, at the conclusion of my presentation, I told my audience that if they changed their beliefs, they could change their lives. It was a familiar conclusion with a familiar response from the participants. Well, Bruce, That's great, but how do we do that? In those days, I didn't fully realize the crucial role of subconscious mind plays in the change process. Instead, I relied mostly on trying to power through negative behavior using positive thinking and willpower. I knew, though, that I had only limited success in making personal changes in my own life. I also knew that when I offered the solution, the energy of the room dropped like a lead balloon. It seems my sophisticated audience had, like me, already tried willpower and positive thinking with limited success. As fate would have it, I returned to my seat and looked up to see that the next presenter was psychotherapist Rob Williams. Rob's opening remarks quickly had the entire audience on the edge of our seats. In his introduction, Rob stated that Psych K can change long-standing limiting beliefs in a matter of minutes. Rob then asked the audience if there was anyone who would like to address an issue that had been troubling them. One woman caught both Rob's and my attention. She raised her hand tentatively, first up, then down, then up again. Her timidity was palpable. When Rob asked what her issue was, her face turned red and her response was inaudible. Rob actually had to leave the podium and confer with her one-on-one. It was Rob who had to inform the audience that her problem was speaking in public. Rob returned to the stage and the woman hesitantly followed. Rob asked her to tell the audience of nearly 100 people a bit about her fear. Again, she could barely speak. Rob worked with the woman for about 10 minutes, using one of the Psych K change techniques. Then he again asked the woman to tell the audience how she felt about speaking to them. The change was astonishing. Not only was she visibly more relaxed, she began talking to the audience in an excited yet confident voice. The eyes of the conference attendees became like saucers, and their mouths dropped as the woman took over the stage for the next 5 minutes. The woman got so carried away that Rob had to ask her to stop speaking and take her seat so he could finish his presentation. Because this woman was a regular attendee at an annual conference and I was a frequent presenter, I was able to witness her amazing transformation over the next several years. She not only had gotten over her fear of public speaking, but eventually went on to organize Toastmasters in her community. Eventually, she became an award-winning public speaker. This woman's life was truly transformed in just a few minutes. In the 15 years since I witnessed that woman's quick transformation, I have seen other people rapidly improve their self-esteem and change their relationships, their finances, and their health using Psych K. The Psych K process is simple, direct, and verifiable. It utilizes the mind-body interface of muscle testing, or kinesiology, that I first discovered as a student chiropractor's makeshift office in the Caribbean to access the self-limiting files of the subconscious mind. It also makes use of left brain, right brain integration techniques to effect swift and long-lasting changes. In addition, Psych K integrates spirit into the change process, just as I have integrated spirit into my understanding of science. Using muscle testing, Psych K assesses what Rob calls the superconscious mind to make sure that the person's stated goals are safe and appropriate. These built-in safeguards allow the system of personal change to be taught to anyone who is interested in taking charge of their lives by moving out of fear and into love. I use Psych K in my own life. Psych K has helped me undo my self-limiting beliefs, including one about not being able to finish my book. The fact that you're holding this book is one indication of the power of Psych K. I also lecture regularly with Rob. Instead of offering positive thinking and willpower at the end of my lectures, I instead happily turn audiences over to Rob. While this book is about the new biology, I believe that Psych K represents an important step towards the new psychology for the 21st century and beyond. You can find more information about Psych K at Rob's website, www.psych-k.com. And here's the website. And that's the end of the book.